Imagine standing in a crowded room where everyone is silent, waiting for instructions. A single figure steps forward and speaks with confidence, directing the group on what to do next. Almost instinctively, people comply. But why? What is it about authority that compels us to follow, often without question? Is obedience a conscious choice, or is it something deeply ingrained in human nature? The evolutionary roots of hierarchy and submission.
Human societies have always been structured around hierarchies. From ancient tribes to modern governments, leadership has been essential for survival. In early human history, following a strong leader increased the chances of survival against external threats. Those who obeyed the leader's commands, whether in hunting, warfare, or resource allocation, ensured the stability of the group. This biological imperative to submit to authority is not merely a social construct but an evolved survival mechanism. Neuroscientific studies suggest that the brain is wired to recognize hierarchy. Certain neural pathways activate when we encounter authority figures, triggering deference or compliance. This is why even in modern democratic societies, individuals still exhibit deep-seated tendencies to follow leaders, whether political, religious, or institutional. Psychological comfort in structure and authority. Chaos is unsettling. Authority provides a sense of order, eliminating uncertainty and offering clear directives. This psychological comfort is especially evident in times of crisis when people naturally seek guidance from perceived authority figures. When faced with complex or high-stakes situations, individuals often default to submission because it reduces cognitive overload, the mental effort required to assess every possible action independently. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that without a central authority, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. His concept of the social contract suggests that individuals willingly surrender some of their autonomy in exchange for protection and order. In this view, submission is not just a passive act but a rational trade-off for security. However, this comfort comes at a cost. When obedience becomes habitual, people may no longer question authority, even when it acts against their own interests. French philosopher Michel Foucault explored this idea through the concept of disciplinary power, in which institutions shape individuals into compliant subjects through rules, norms, and expectations. Schools, workplaces, and legal systems reinforce obedience as a virtue, making submission feel like a natural part of existence rather than an imposed condition. The role of childhood conditioning in obedience. The seeds of obedience are planted early in life. From a young age, children are taught to listen to parents, respect teachers, and follow rules. This conditioning is not necessarily malicious. It is a means of socializing individuals into functional members of society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, however, warned of the dangers of excessive societal conditioning, arguing that rigid obedience suppresses individual freedom and natural human goodness. Behaviorist psychology further explains this through operant conditioning, where rewards reinforce compliance and punishments deter defiance. A child who questions authority too often may face social or disciplinary consequences, discouraging future acts of resistance. Over time, this conditioning becomes internalized, leading to an instinctive submission to figures of authority, even when their legitimacy is questionable. Friedrich Nietzsche offered a sharp critique of this form of social conditioning, describing it as the foundation of slave morality, a mindset that glorifies submission, humility, and conformity at the expense of individual strength and self-determination. He argued that those who blindly obey authority surrender their power, becoming passive agents of the systems that control them. Obedience, then, is not merely a personal decision but the result of centuries of evolutionary, psychological, and social reinforcement. It is embedded in the fabric of human existence, shaping how individuals interact with power and authority. But as history has shown, this deep-seated tendency to submit is not without its dangers. The illusion of free will. If someone ordered you to inflict pain on an innocent person, would you obey? Most people would instinctively say no. Yet history, psychology, and philosophy suggest otherwise. The assumption that we act out of free will and moral reasoning is challenged when authority enters the equation. Psychological experiments have demonstrated that submission to power is not merely a product of personal weakness or ignorance. It is an intrinsic part of human nature, deeply woven into the way we respond to social structures. Milgram's obedience study, The Power of Perceived Authority. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted a now infamous experiment to test the limits of human obedience. Participants were instructed by an authority figure to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to a person in another room whenever they answered a question incorrectly. Unbeknownst to the participants, the shocks were fake, and the individual being shocked was an actor. Despite hearing cries of pain, most participants continued to obey the experimenter, even when they believed they were causing serious harm. This experiment revealed something unsettling. Obedience to authority can override personal morality. Milgram's findings support Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, the idea that ordinary people commit atrocities not because they are inherently monstrous, but because they are conditioned to obey orders without critically questioning their implications. The experiment demonstrated that submission to power is not confined to historical dictatorships or military regimes. It is a universal tendency that exists in all societies. From a philosophical perspective, this challenges Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist claim that individuals are entirely free to choose their actions. If external authority has the power to subdue moral resistance so easily, then human freedom may be far more fragile than we assume. The experiment forces us to ask, when we comply with authority, are we truly making a choice, or are we surrendering our autonomy without realizing it? The Stanford Prison Experiment: How Roles Shape Submission. A decade after Milgram's study, Philip Zimbardo conducted the Stanford Prison Experiment to explore how authority roles affect behavior. Participants were randomly assigned as either prisoners or guards in a simulated prison environment. Within days, the guards began exhibiting cruel and authoritarian behaviors, while the prisoners became submissive, passive, and emotionally distressed. The experiment was terminated early due to the extreme psychological effects on both groups. Zimbardo's findings echo Michel Foucault's analysis of disciplinary power, which argues that institutions do not merely enforce rules but shape identities. When individuals are placed in systems of authority, they unconsciously adopt the behaviors expected of them. Submission, then, is not just about obeying orders. It is about internalizing the power structures that dictate social roles. The implications of this experiment extend beyond the prison system. In workplaces, military institutions, and political structures, people assume hierarchical roles that subtly dictate their behaviors and limit their ability to resist. Even in democratic societies, submission to power is reinforced through routine social interactions, making disobedience feel unnatural or even dangerous. If an individual's identity can be reshaped so easily by an external system, can we ever claim to possess an independent sense of self? Asker's conformity experiment, the pressure to fit in. While Milgram and Zimbardo focused on direct authority, Solomon Asker's conformity experiments explored the subtler forces of social pressure. Participants were placed in a group and asked to compare the lengths of lines. Unbeknownst to them, the other members of the group were actors instructed to give deliberately incorrect answers. Astonishingly, many participants conformed to the wrong answers, even when the truth was obvious. This study demonstrates that submission is not always enforced through explicit commands. It can emerge through the silent influence of the majority. Nietzsche's critique of herd morality aligns with this phenomenon, arguing that society suppresses independent thought by instilling the need for belonging and approval. The fear of standing alone often outweighs the desire for truth, leading individuals to conform even when they recognize the facade of the majority's beliefs. The Asker experiment forces us to consider how much of our obedience is driven by genuine belief and how much is dictated by the unspoken pressure to align with the group. If entire populations can be led to conform to obvious facades, then mass submission to authority may not be an anomaly, but an inevitability. The psychological mechanisms behind submission in experiments. These experiments, though distinct, reveal recurring themes in the psychology of obedience. Authority legitimizes control. People obey because they perceive figures of authority as rightful leaders. Fear overrides morality. The consequences of defying authority, whether real or perceived, compel compliance. Social identity is malleable. People assume roles dictated by institutions, often without questioning their legitimacy. Conformity suppresses dissent. The need for social cohesion makes individuals reluctant to challenge the majority. Taken together, these findings suggest that obedience is not merely a rational choice but a deeply embedded psychological response. Authority has the power to shape thought, dictate behavior, and suppress individual agency, often without the subject's awareness. But if these mechanisms are so powerful, what happens when authority is taken to its extreme? The thin line between order and oppression. A society without authority collapses into chaos, yet a society that blindly submits to authority risks becoming a machine of oppression. History is littered with moments when obedience led to destruction, when individuals, in their submission to power, became instruments of suffering. How does obedience transform from a necessary social function into a mechanism of tyranny? Is submission to authority always a moral failing, or is it an inevitable part of human nature? Historical examples of blind obedience leading to atrocities. From the horrors of Nazi Germany to the massacres of the Khmer Rouge, blind obedience has often been at the root of humanity's darkest moments. The Nuremberg trials revealed how ordinary people became perpetrators of genocide, not out of personal hatred, but because they followed orders. The chilling defense, "I was just following orders," exposed an unsettling reality. Obedience, when taken to its extreme, can strip away moral responsibility. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil argues that atrocities are not always committed by monstrous individuals but by bureaucrats and soldiers who obey without question. Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, was not driven by sadistic pleasure but by efficiency and duty. His loyalty to authority overshadowed his ethical considerations, making him a cog in a machine of destruction. Philosopher Theodor Adorno's work on authoritarian personality suggests that some individuals are psychologically predisposed to submit to authority, especially in hierarchical and nationalistic societies. Under the right conditions, entire populations can be molded into compliant subjects, willing to enforce oppressive systems without questioning their morality. The banality of evil and everyday obedience. While extreme historical examples highlight the dangers of submission, obedience operates in more subtle forms in everyday life. The bureaucratic systems that run governments, corporations, and institutions rely on individuals who perform their duties without questioning their broader ethical implications. The economist and philosopher Max Weber warned of the iron cage of rationality, where efficiency and rule-following replace moral judgment. Bureaucratic obedience makes oppressive systems function smoothly. The officer who enforces an unjust law, the doctor who denies treatment due to administrative policies, the employee who follows exploitative corporate orders. These are not acts of overt cruelty, yet they contribute to systemic harm. Submission to authority is often not dramatic or violent. It is silent, methodical, and unthinking. Friedrich Nietzsche critiqued this passive submission as slave morality, a mindset that prioritizes obedience and conformity over strength and self-determination. In this view, societal structures encourage submission by glorifying discipline, humility, and duty, turning individuals into willing servants of the status quo. The dangers of ideological indoctrination and propaganda. Obedience does not always require direct coercion. In many cases, submission is manufactured through ideology and propaganda. Governments, religious institutions, and media shape public perception, creating narratives that justify authority and discourage dissent. George Orwell's 1984 illustrates how language itself can be weaponized to enforce submission. Through doublethink and newspeak, individuals are conditioned to accept contradictions and abandon critical thinking. When authority controls information, it shapes reality, making resistance feel impossible. French philosopher Louis Althusser expanded on this idea through the concept of ideological state apparatuses, arguing that schools, churches, and cultural institutions produce obedient citizens by embedding authority into everyday life. By the time an individual reaches adulthood, submission feels not only normal but necessary. The psychological power of propaganda explains why oppressive regimes often do not require constant force to maintain control. When individuals internalize authority's legitimacy, they police themselves, suppressing dissent before it even arises. The philosopher Antonio Gramsci referred to this as cultural hegemony, where obedience is reinforced not through direct oppression, but through social norms and accepted beliefs. The psychological cost of submission. Beyond its social and political dangers, obedience also has profound psychological consequences. Studies have shown that individuals who conform to unjust authority often experience cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of acting against their moral values. Over time, Repeated submission can lead to emotional numbness, detachment, and even moral disengagement. Erich Fromm, in Escape from Freedom, argued that many people submit to authority not out of fear, but because freedom itself is overwhelming. True autonomy requires constant self-examination, responsibility, and moral courage, qualities that obedience relieves individuals from having to cultivate. In this sense, submission can be seen as a form of psychological security, a way to avoid the burden of independent thought. When authority is wielded justly, obedience can create stability and cooperation. But when submission becomes unthinking, when authority is left unchecked, the consequences can be catastrophic. What, then, allows some individuals to resist authority when so many others submit? The weight of choice. At every moment, individuals stand at a crossroads between obedience and resistance. The forces that shape submission, fear, habit, social conditioning, are powerful, but so too is the ability to question, to challenge, to say no. The history of human civilization is not merely a history of those who followed orders, but also of those who defied them, reshaping the world in their refusal to comply. If obedience is a fundamental aspect of human nature, then so is the struggle for autonomy. The question remains, which force will define the individual? The balance between structure and individual agency. Obedience is not inherently evil, nor is authority always oppressive. Societies require order to function, and individuals cannot exist in a vacuum of total independence. However, when submission becomes unthinking, when obedience is demanded rather than earned, when authority ceases to justify itself, then the moral obligation shifts. The preservation of dignity and justice demands the willingness to challenge authority, to refuse complicity, and to recognize when submission becomes a betrayal of one's own conscience. Philosopher John Stuart Mill warned against the tyranny of the majority, the silent oppression that arises not through violence but through conformity. It is not only explicit commands that must be questioned, but also the subtle pressures that mold individuals into passive subjects. True freedom is not the mere absence of oppression, it is the active pursuit of independent thought, the refusal to let authority dictate morality, encouraging critical thinking and questioning authority. The antidote to blind obedience is not chaos but critical thought. To question authority does not mean to reject all forms of structure, but to demand justification for power. Socrates' challenge to Athenian democracy was not an act of rebellion for its own sake, but an assertion that authority must be held accountable to reason. In an era where information is abundant yet manipulation is sophisticated, the ability to think critically is more vital than ever. Propaganda, ideological conditioning, and social pressures do not always come in obvious forms. They are embedded in education, media, tradition, and collective memory. The responsibility of the individual is to cultivate an awareness of these forces, to interrogate their influence, and to choose not merely to obey, but to understand. The responsibility of moral courage. History has shown that obedience can build nations, but it can also destroy them. Resistance is not the domain of the radical or the extraordinary. It is the responsibility of every individual who values truth over comfort, integrity over conformity. The choice to submit or to resist is not a theoretical dilemma. It is a decision made in everyday actions, in small moments where authority demands compliance without question. To break the cycle of blind obedience requires more than awareness, it demands action. It means refusing to be silent in the face of injustice, questioning systems that demand unowned loyalty, and embracing the discomfort that comes with independent thought. It means understanding that while obedience may be the easier path, the harder road, the one walked by philosophers, revolutionaries, and free thinkers, is the one that leads to true autonomy. The final question is not whether authority exists, nor whether obedience is necessary, but whether individuals will choose to be passive instruments of power or active architects of their own conscience.